Morning in Los Angeles smelled of coffee beans, faded rain, and sunlight that always began its journey too early. Brad Pitt stood by the window of an old cafe at the corner of La Brea and Fairfax, holding a latte that had already turned a little colder than he'd like. He wasn't in a hurry. He wore regular jeans, a faded shirt, and sunglasses that hadn't hidden him from others' gazes for a long time but still helped him feel at least a little distant. He loved this cafe because here, people almost didn't recognize him. They came for coffee, not selfies. Lately, he'd been feeling strange. There was a nagging sense that everything around him had become, somehow, secondary. Roles, scenes, endless interviews, they seemed to have lost their weight. Even premieres no longer felt new, just repetitions of long-played-out stories. Sometimes you're alive, but it feels like life is living you. He stared out at the street, watching passers-by rush by, thinking about how much determination, haste, and pain was written on their faces. At times, he felt like he had everything, except for something essential. But what was it? He didn't know. Or didn't want to know. The cup was nearly empty when he noticed a man standing by the entrance. He didn't look like a typical beggar, not dirty, no cardboard sign. Just a tired, cold person with eyes full of something familiar. Brad felt an odd connection for a second, like he had seen him somewhere before. Maybe in another life. Or on a screen. The man approached hesitantly, as if wavering until the last moment. He looked Brad straight in the eye. "Listen," he began, and his voice was neither drunk nor aggressive. "It's not for food. I just need $1. Just one. I need a chance." Brad paused. It was such a small moment that most people would have walked right by. But something about that phrase, "I need a chance," pierced through him. He reached into his jeans pocket. There was a single dollar, slightly creased down the middle, with an odd embossed mark that Brad didn't even notice. He handed it to the man. "Just one," he said with a smirk. "Hope it's magic." The man took the bill carefully, almost like a relic, and held it in his hand. "It is," he said simply. "Thank you." And he walked away. Brad remained standing there, with an empty cup and a light, strange sense of calm. He didn't know what had just happened. But for some reason, he wanted to sit back down, finish his now cold coffee, and not rush anywhere. Sometimes, moments mean more than years. A few hours later, Brad got back into his car and drove toward the hills. The radio was playing old blues, and the familiar streets passed by outside the window. But inside him remained the imprint of that brief glance, that simple request, and the phrase, "I need a chance." He thought of himself, 20 years old, full of dreams and an empty wallet. And it felt like that guy was a reflection of what he could have become if he hadn't gotten lucky once. Or if someone hadn't given him his own dollar. That evening, he told a friend about it, without names, without drama. "Just gave a guy $1, he said, pouring himself a glass of wine. "I don't know. Maybe it's not about the dollar. Just felt like I passed something on." His friend shrugged. "Well, you know, for someone, that can be the beginning." Brad nodded silently. Then, half joking, he added, "What if it is magic?" They both laughed. Brad had no idea that within days, that very bill would become the center of a chain of events capable of changing not only the fate of that stranger, but of reminding the world that even the simplest gestures can be the trigger for something far greater than we can imagine. But for now, it was just $1. And a strange feeling that he'd done something important without even realizing it. Jake held the dollar in his hand like it was something more than just currency. The paper was a bit crumpled, with a strange dent in the left corner, as if someone had once folded it and then changed their mind. But that wasn't the point. He couldn't explain why, but something inside had clicked when he got it. As if the world had slightly tilted in his favor. He walked down Vine Street, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't slouched under the weight of despair, but upright. Yes, he still had no home, no money, no future. But he had this $1. And a feeling that he wasn't supposed to use it as charity, but as a sign. A signal. He stepped into a 24-hour store. Normally, he would have bought a cheap pastry and a can of cola. But not now. Deep down, he felt like this dollar wasn't meant for food. He walked back out, and just then his eyes caught an old bulletin board near the entrance. It was cluttered with everything from phone repair ads to learn to play ukulele for $20 flyers. But in the middle of that paper chaos, one note stood out. On a plain white sheet, handwritten. You don't know what you're looking for until you try. $1, your chance. Today. 4 p.m. Bookstore on Melrose. Don't be late. He blinked. It looked almost like a prank, but also like a strange continuation of the morning. He checked the time. It was 3:19 p.m. Jake reached the bookstore in 15 minutes, out of breath. The place was old, cozy, and nearly empty. The cashier, an elderly man with a beard and the kind of eyes only people who've read too many books have, didn't even seem surprised when Jake walked up and silently placed the dollar on the counter. You need the second floor, the man said, without asking for his name or purpose. Upstairs was a reading hall. The wooden floor creaked slightly, the shelves were scattered and out of order. In the corner sat a man in a grey blazer, holding a thin notebook in his hands. You brought the dollar? He asked without looking up. Yes, Jake replied, a chill running down his spine. Everything about this felt too synchronized. The man nodded, stood up, and handed him that very same notebook. It's yours now. Read it. But only once. After that, decide what to do next. He left, offering no further explanation, leaving Jake alone in the silence between the bookshelves and dusty lamps. The notebook looked old, but well kept. The cover, leather, with embossed initials, W.R. Jake sat down on the floor by the window and opened to the first page. There were just 3 words. One chance. One choice. One outcome. Then came the text, like a diary, but not quite. It was a mix of notes, stories, thoughts, and tasks. As if the writer wanted to give the reader something more than just information. On one of the pages, there was a rough sketch, a network of arrows and lines, and in the center it said, "Every event is the start of a new probability. The slightest impulse can alter the structure of an entire day." That's where Jake paused. He remembered hesitating that morning, unsure whether to ask for $1. How one sentence, "I just need a chance," slipped from his lips almost by accident. And how Brad, with a faint smile, had actually given him the $1, not knowing what it would lead to. Jake closed the book, heart pounding. He felt it, this was more than mere coincidence. That evening, he sat on the roof of an abandoned building in the Silver Lake area, where he sometimes spent the night. The wind brushed his face, and the moon peeked out from behind the clouds. He still had the same notebook in his hands. But now he held it differently, like it was a key. On the last page, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, an address written in pencil. And a date, tomorrow. 7 p.m. He didn't know what it meant. But something inside told him he had to go. That everything that began with that dollar bill was only just beginning. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Brad Pitt sat on his balcony, sipping mint tea. He remembered the face of that guy, Jake, and the words, "I just need a chance." Something about it lingered. For the first time in a long while, he felt he had done something not just kind, but real. He even checked his wallet to make sure he didn't have any more of those same $1 bills. But in the bottom of the pocket, he found something strange, another bill. An exact copy of the one he gave away. Same crease. Same mark. He frowned. What the? He pulled it out and felt a chill in his gut. It wasn't just similar, it was the exact same bill. With his handwriting on the fold, BRP, which he sometimes scribbled on things so they wouldn't get lost on set. Brad stared at the dollar and slowly, almost in a whisper, said, "What the hell is going on?" A few days had passed. Jake still had the very notebook he found along with the dollar. He still couldn't understand why someone had placed it there at the exact moment he was about to give up. On one of the pages, a message was written. What seems like coincidence isn't always random. Sometimes, it's an invitation. He kept racking his brain. No phone numbers, no names. Just an address, a building at the intersection of two streets. He went there expecting something dangerous. Mysterious? But it turned out to be much simpler. "Oh, you're the guy who found the notebook," said a young man in a sweatshirt with a badge that read, "Eric, Project Coordinator." "What project?" "The Dollar Decides. It's a small experiment we're running across the country. The idea is to show how even the smallest act of attention can change someone's trajectory. One person, $1, one story." Brad Pitt happened to be one of the random participants. He didn't even know he became part of the chain. "So, this isn't a cult?" Jake asked, slightly embarrassed. Eric laughed. "No, it's just, well, kind of a social experiment with real consequences. We're looking for people like you. People who, no matter what, keep looking for a path. You don't have to take part. But we're offering you a platform, a mentor, some resources, and a chance to do something with that chance." Meanwhile, Brad Pitt was sitting on his terrace, reading a letter. It was from the same coordinator, Eric. "Thank you for giving the $1. It became part of a larger story. One of the participants, Jake, would like to thank you personally. If you're interested, we can arrange a meeting." Brad paused. He remembered the guy's face. Ordinary. A bit lost. But not broken. Something about that gesture, giving $1, had struck him too. He suddenly realized he was genuinely curious to see what had come out of it. "Let's set up the meeting," he replied. "And yes, tell me more about this $1 thing. Feels like it might be more important than just a random coin." Later, when they met, the atmosphere was almost awkward. Jake didn't know how to behave in front of a movie star, and Brad tried to speak as casually as possible. "I didn't think you even noticed me," Jake said. "And I had no idea my $1 would end up in a story like this." "But I'm glad it did," Brad replied. "You know, I haven't always understood why things happen. Why me? But maybe even random actions can trigger something, like a butterfly effect." Jake smiled. "Only this butterfly has Pitt's autograph." They both laughed. Now that the initial fear had faded, Jake felt he had a choice. This story could have ended as just a strange coincidence. But he decided it was only the beginning. The Californian morning was as bright as the idea brewing in Brad Pitt's mind. He was sitting on the porch of a small space that the Dollar Decides organization had set aside for the first steps of their new initiative. Beside him was Jake, no longer in a worn-out jacket, but in a light cotton shirt. He looked focused, a bit on edge, like someone who still doubts if any of this is real. "Be honest," Jake started, "why didn't you just shake my hand and walk away?" Brad smiled. "Because you stayed in my head. Not your face. Not what you said. But the moment itself. You were standing there like you were waiting for something. Or maybe, on the contrary, you weren't waiting for anything anymore. I know that feeling." "You?" Jake was surprised. "You're Brad Pitt." "Yeah," the actor smirked. "And I'm also a person. Sometimes, by the way, with some pretty complicated thoughts. There were moments when I also felt like everything I was doing was pointless. And no $1 would change that. But here's the funny part, sometimes, it's in those very moments that something important happens. And it doesn't matter if you're famous or not." They were silent for a moment. Then Jake opened the notebook, the very one. "I thought, what if there are thousands of people like me? People who are just on the edge. And no one will give them $1 million, but they don't need $1 million. They need a sign. Confidence. Or just that someone is there." Brad nodded. And then suddenly said, "What if we give them that sign?" "How?" Through you. Through me. Through a simple gesture. Here's $1. But not just like that. You get it, and you can keep it. Or pass it on. But only with one condition: you have to say something. One piece of advice. One thought. One thing you learned when you were at your lowest. So, it's like a game? No, Brad said seriously. It's like a reminder system. A reminder that you're not alone. They started small. Brad recorded a video on his phone. This $1 once helped someone. Now it will go further. And everyone who receives it can pass on not just a coin, but a piece of hope. From themselves. This isn't charity. This is human. Share kindness. Tell stories. And be attentive to those who are on the edge. 2 days later, at a local coffee shop, Jake passed the first $1 to a guy who couldn't pay for his sandwich. "Hey, I know this might seem strange," he said. "But here. This $1 was once given to me by Brad Pitt." Seriously. And then I realized, it's not about the money. It's about how even in the most ordinary moment, something big can begin. The guy was initially surprised. Then he laughed. "Are you messing with me?" "Absolutely not. Just pass it on when you feel someone needs something more than just change." The project was called the $1 Chain. It wasn't about money. It was about involvement. About attention. About the little things. People shared short videos, letters, photos. And now every $1 had its own story. Not value, but a journey. One day, Brad came to Jake and said, "You know what the power of all this is?" "What?" "That it didn't even start with me. It started with you not walking away. You saw not just $1, you saw meaning. I just passed it on. And that was the whole point. Sometimes, to change a life, you don't need $1 million. You need a person. Or a gesture. Or $1. Several months passed. The $1 Chain project had attracted attention not only from local residents but also from major media outlets. Inspired by the stories, people began sharing their own dollars, symbols of hope and small changes. Social media was flooded with videos where people told their stories and passed the $1 on. Jake couldn't believe how quickly the project had grown. One day, he received a call from one of the big news channels. "Jake, we'd like to invite you to a live broadcast. You know, the story with the $1 has exploded on the internet. What do you think about it?" He turned his gaze away from the screen, which was filling the room with light. "I don't know what to think. It all happened so fast. I just wanted to help. I gave $1, and look what happened. But now it's not just a help. It's a movement. People are inspired. We want you to tell us how it all started." Jake paused. He was the type of person who usually stayed in the background, away from the cameras. But this project was something personal. He felt that every new step wasn't just for him, but for all those people who needed a small gesture. He reached out to Brad Pitt, who, as always, was available. "Are you sure you're ready for all of this?" Brad asked over the phone when Jake told him about the offer. "Honestly, Brad, I don't know. It's like a snowball rolling down the hill, and I don't want it to become an avalanche. I just don't want to lose the essence of it." Brad smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "You know, that's the whole point. You won't be alone in this. I'll always be here. Remember, the project isn't about putting you in the spotlight. It's about people. About how one gesture can impact a whole life. But how can we keep it real if it's going beyond a small initiative? We'll remember why we started this. Trust me, Jake. When we began, it was your choice. You don't need to be a public figure to do something important." Jake was grateful for the support, but he couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility. As soon as the project became popular, he felt the weight of expectations. That evening, before the live broadcast, Jake stood in front of the mirror and rehearsed his answers. He wasn't ready for this. But he couldn't back down. He knew that if he didn't go now, the opportunity would slip away. He stepped onto the stage. The audience was there, their faces expecting revelations. The host smiled and shook his hand. "Jake, tell us, how did the idea of the $1 chain come about?" He took a deep breath and began. "You know, at one point, I was on the edge. Life wasn't asking questions, it was just going, and I was sort of sliding through it. But then I met Brad Pitt. He gave me $1. It wasn't about the money, it was about the gesture that said, 'You're not alone.' I thought, maybe that's exactly what each of us needs, a reminder that we all need support at some point." He paused, looking around the room. "I passed the dollar on. And that's how the chain started. I never expected it to grow this fast. That's the power of it. A simple act of help, asking for nothing in return except honesty," said the host, shifting his gaze to the screen where stories of people sharing their dollars flickered in the background. "Yes," Jake continued, "and the main thing is that this dollar isn't meant to change the world. It's meant to help us see each other. Sometimes, a person just needs to know they've been noticed." That evening, Jake realized that his project wasn't part of some grand plan. It was the beginning of a chain that would continue. Even if it became part of something bigger, he knew, if you believe in simple, sincere things, everything will fall into place. After the broadcast, his Instagram was filled with new followers, and other people began sharing their stories in the comments. Jake didn't yet know how he would move forward. But he understood one thing: this wasn't a coincidence. The next morning, Brad Pitt sent him a short message. "You're not alone. And now there are many of us. So don't worry if it gets tough. You chose the right path." Jake smiled as he read the message. Now that he had not only $1 but something greater, he knew he would move forward, just as before. And if other obstacles appeared along the way, Brad would be there. Half a year had passed. Jake sat in the small cafe where it all began. He watched the people coming and going, unaware that one day, that simple dollar that had ended up in their hands could change their lives. The $1 chain project had grown into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Thousands of people around the world had begun participating in the initiative. The gesture, which had become a symbol of kindness and response, had spread across countries, cities, and even continents. Its photos and videos went viral. People shared their stories, their emotions, and joy, passing the dollar along as a small reminder that they were not alone in their struggles. But with the rise in popularity came new challenges. Jake felt the pressure. Pressure from the media, from people, even from himself. At times, it seemed like he had lost control. It was hard to maintain a balance between the personal and the public, between sincerity and commercialization. Sometimes he wondered if the whole project might lose its meaning in the pursuit of attention. He placed his hand on the table and looked at the empty chair in front of him. This moment felt like a sign: Brad was supposed to come. He always appeared at times when Jake struggled to find answers. "You always know where to find me," he heard the familiar voice. Brad Pitt walked into the cafe with a slight smile and sat down across from him. "Hey," Jake sighed. "It's all getting complicated. I don't know how to deal with all this attention." "It's fine," Brad replied. "You don't have to handle everything all at once. Look how far you've come." Jake glanced at his phone, where a live broadcast was showing a message from a girl who had shared her story about how the dollar helped her get through tough times. "Yeah, but I can't control where this is going. What if it's not what I wanted?" "You didn't start this with ambitions to make it a global project. It all began with $1, one person. And now it's much bigger. But the meaning has stayed the same. What matters is that you haven't changed. You're still passing that sign to people. And it doesn't stop." Jake thought for a moment. Brad's words were simple but genuine. It's like a snowball, right? It grows, but you can't predict how it'll end up. Exactly, Brad smiled. And you know, I've always said that we can't plan how the story will end. What matters is how it starts. And you started with something simple. What happens next isn't your responsibility. It's up to those who will continue the chain. Jake nodded and looked out the window. The outside world now seemed like part of something bigger than just his life or his project. People came and went, each with their own thoughts, struggles, and hopes. He noticed how one woman, hearing the bell, pulled out a wallet and placed $1 on the table. It wasn't like the other dollars from before, but it was the one that continued the chain. That's the point, isn't it? Jake asked. Yes, Brad answered. That's the chain. But remember, no one will tell you how to continue it. You can give it a new start. What happens next depends on those who believe in this idea. Jake smiled. He felt the heavy burden of responsibility lift a little. He knew he didn't have to be the driving force behind the changes. That wasn't his job. He had only passed that $1 into the hands of other people, and they would decide where it would go next. Are you ready? Brad stood up and walked toward the door. Jake thought for a few seconds. Yeah, I'm ready. Let it be something bigger than me. Let it continue. They left the cafe. In Jake's hands was the same $1. It was now a part of life, just like all the others. No matter how many people would join the chain, how many stories would emerge around each new step, he knew it would continue. But he couldn't say how or when. It wasn't just a story. It was a story without an end.